Gee, I see your chick, she wanna kiss me, no this and the nothing but me is VIP, I'm coming through. Watch me, you know how I do. Most of the time I'm rocking through and chilling with the crew. Better known as a nation, we be all about the nation. On the lake, no chasing, paper chasing. Alright, alright, alright. And I be chasing my paper, chasing my paper, yeah, chasing my paper, chasing sales, chasing my paper, alright. I'm just chasing my paper, alright. Hey, I can't do nothing, no bluffing, no discussion about the cash. All about that. Nothing but me is VIP, I'm coming through. Watch me, you know how I do. Most of the time I'm rocking through and chilling with the crew. Better known as a nation, we be all about the nation. On the lake, no chasing, paper chasing face. Don't give a damn till you pussy niggas hate. All up in my land, get the fuck up out my face. Nah, I ain't playing, you can catch the fucking face. Catch the fucking face or a face to the chin. I don't give a damn what the fuck you do to me. I don't give a damn what the fuck we go to me. And I be chasing that paper, chasing that paper, chasing that paper. Alright, alright, well alright, well alright. Yeah, nothing but me is VIP, I'm coming through. Watch me, you know how I do. Most of the time I'm rocking through and chilling with the crew. Better known as a nation, we be all about the nation. On the lake, no chasing, paper chasing that paper. Chasing that paper, no, chasing that paper, chasing that paper. Alright, 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 alright. Ooh, that's that classic right there, boy. What damn wallet at? I left that bitch at home, huh? Fuck. niggas at? Right here, over there, over there, over there, over there. Where the real bitches at? Right here, over there, over there, over there, over there. Where the real niggas at? Right here, over there, over there, over there, over there. Where the real bitches at? Right here, over there, over there, over there, over there. Where the real niggas at? Right here, over there, over there, over there.